Good morning, everybody in Seoul, and good afternoon, who is joining from Boston in the United States. My name is Sung-ho Shin, and I'm a professor at Graduate School of International Studies at Seoul National University. And I'm a moderator for today's seminar hosted by East Asia Institute, which is, and this seminar is a part of EAI project on Global NK, Global North Korea. And this is a Zoom and Connect online seminar series. And today's topic is denuclearization of DPRK still viable. And we have excellent panel today. The three panelists, specialists, and experts on these issues. Let me introduce three panel first. First, we have Dr. Byun Jo, who is a research fellow at the Korean Institute of Defense Analysis at the Center for Security and Strategy. Dr. Jo has been also working on recently extended deterrence and nuclear issues on the Korean Peninsula. And second, we have Professor Won-gon Park, who is a professor at the North Korea Study Department at the Ewha Women's University, who has been a long time Korea watcher and North Korea specialist, yet at the same time, who also give a lot of comment on the US-Korea alliance and the Korean Peninsula security issues. And finally, we have Dr. John Park, who is a director of a Korea Studies program at the Harvard Kennedy School Belfer Center. And unfortunately, at this moment, John Park has a certain delay of his airplane back in Boston right now. So we are expecting that he will be joining us still later, a little bit later. So today we are going to discuss the ongoing current situation on the Korean Peninsula, especially with regard to the recent development in North Korea's nuclear policy, and also their activity regarding those issues. In particular, we have this early September, North Korea's government and Kim Jong-un regime issuing a new nuclear law, saying among all the others, there will be a kind of a preemptive nuclear attack in case of a certain emergency to the regime, or especially to the Kim's leadership. And following on that special new law, North Korean regime has been conducting lots of missile tests. And the latest one was the firing of Hwasong-17, which most analysts says that it was a very successful launch of a new ICBM with a range up to 15,000 kilometers. That means that can reach most of the United States. So with that development, lots of people these days, experts, saying that maybe the possibility of denuclearization is, the chances are getting smaller and smaller, and more people are becoming more skeptical about peaceful resolution of this nuclear issue. So we will be dealing with that issue at this moment. Again, is denuclearization of DPRK still viable? On that, we will have a kind of round table discussion among three panelists. along with three, a set of questions or topics. So the first question goes in September, as I said before, Pyongyang announced a new law on DPRK's nuclear forces, which included possible preemptive use of a nuclear weapon under certain conditions. So how you assess that North Korea's intention or this new law? What is your opinion on this development? Maybe starting with Dr. Jo, we can briefly comment on that issue and followed by the Professor Park.
Thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity to join the great panel and also Professor Shin as moderator. I'm more than honored to be part of this dialogue. Regarding the first question, I think I should begin with two major changes that I noticed with the law. Number one is that North Korea's nuclear doctrine, as this law has come out, has become, as I would put bluntly, offensive. As you all know, while North Korea's previous rhetoric and claims on nuclear weapons have forged around the concept of no first use, and also they have argued that it's for their security assurance purposes. But this new law, what it does is it's now bluntly demonstrating that North Korea actually aims for a kind of a flexible nuclear use that includes even automatic use of the nuclear weapons as outlined in the Article 3 of the nuclear law. And also the law also includes the possibilities of first use of nuclear weapons and also the use of nuclear weapons against non-nuclear attacks. So I think this is whether the real intention is preemptive or not, the offensive doctrine has emerged. And the second observation I make is that North Korea seems to be enhancing the implementation capability of the nuclear use. Main ground for that is, as outlined in Article 3, not only transitioning the authority of nuclear use to the president from the Supreme Commander of the KPA. What's new in this new law is they have institutionalized the support advisory organization, which is, to me, seems like materializations of tangible institutions. And this implies that there is tangible progress in North Korea's nuclear development, including the tactical use, and also coming up with operational strategy of the nuclear use. And for kind of wrap up, I think these two changes are important because they imply three very important things for us. Number one, it signals that North Korea, well, it's stated that North Korea will not denuclearize because the new law makes their nuclear weapons fait accompli. And because the nuclear weapons become kind of already given, this means that we are more likely to face North Korea's instrumentalization of tactical nukes as one of their course strategies. And lastly, all interrelated, because nuclear use and nuclear threat become so frequently discussed. I think this is very different from the past when this phrase of nuclear use was more treated like a taboo. But now, both from North Korea and also in South Korea and also other allies' response, this nuclear option is more frequently conversed than before. And so this all contributes, in my view, to the lowering of the threshold of the nuclear use. Yes, I'll end here. Thank you.
Well, okay. Very excellent, analysis of what this means in terms of North Korea's nuclear doctrine or actual implementation, and also, yes, lowering the threshold of possible nuclear weapon use on the Korean Peninsula. What is your take, Professor Park?
All right. First of all, I'm very glad to be joining of this very meaningful webinar with such an expert, the Dr. Jo And also I'm waiting for my old friend, John, and also, of course, Dr. Shin. And I agree with what the Bjorn mentioned, and it's pretty much a very radical and aggressive and also offensive nuclear doctrine they had introduced. And interestingly enough, North Korea has actually passed the law in 2013 in the title of solidifying the status of self-defense nuclear power. At the time, they are pretty much some kind of a defensive posture. And they said that it is inevitable to develop their nuclear weapon because of the United States threat, nuclear threat. But this time is totally changed. I agree with beyond that, North Korea is trying to institutionalize and formalize this very radical and aggressive nuclear doctrine. And I think a couple of things already, I think Bjorn mentioned, but if I reiterate, a couple of things are important. And first, the nuclear forces of DPRK, of course, I'm talking about North Korea, shall obey the monolithic command of Kim Jong-un. And they keep mentioning that Kim Jong-un has all decisive powers to concerning nuclear weapons, period. I think this is the most important part. And second, and also the laws authorize the use of nuclear weapons in practically any circumstances. They are talking about the 5 conditions, but when we read of these 5 conditions, it includes everything. And not only they are going to use, but also they are saying that drew near, which means that preemptively use this nuclear weapon in the almost every situations. And for example, attacked by nuclear weapon by the outsider, and if they felt a fatal military attack, and also preventing the expansion and protection of a war and taking the initiative, everything. But the most worrisome contents they introduce is that situation that cause a threat to the people's lives and their safety. It's pretty much a very vague conditions. And it does not specify any the situation, and which leaves room for the a very arbitrary interpretation. It reminds me the April speech of Kim Jong-un. I think many people remember that the military parade speech that North Korea is going to use the nuclear weapons in the non-military situation. At the time, Kim Jong-un mentioned that if the North Korea's national interests are infringed, then they're going to use a nuclear weapon. So overall, this is a very radical. And if we compare to the other nuclear weapon states doctrine, for example, like United States, China, and Russia, they are, kind of pretty much maintain so-called strategic ambiguity, and they introduce very basic principles, and they're not going to mentioning about very detailed conditions as like the North Korea's did in September. So this is also, I think, kind of a political intention and purpose to introduce this nuclear weapon, the nuclear law. And I think at least 2 of them are the political purpose. First, the status of DPRK as a nuclear weapon state has been irreversible. And Kim Jong-un in his speech at the Supreme National Assembly, he said that their nuclear weapon is irreversible. And he kept mentioning that several times. And which means that they are not going to bargaining about their nuclear weapon with the United States. So only their remaining option is to negotiate nuclear arms reductions, or at the maximum, I think, a partial denuclearization, not the denuclearization of North Korea, even denuclearization of the Joseon Peninsula, which means Korean Peninsula. And also because they are making it as law, it means that they themselves is limiting the kind of options, and which means that if they have the fewer options when they have this negotiation with the United States, they are going to have a more advantageous position. They are saying that, because of this law, we could not talk about the denuclearization, and rather we have to talk about the arms reduction on the partial denuclearization. That's their maximum. So I think that it is one of their major intentions to introduce this law. And finally, when we read this law, and at the same time, the Kim Jong-un's speech at the Supreme People's Assembly in September, it highlights Kim Jong-un's achievement. And I'm very interesting about his speech because he brought so-called 총대 philosophy, which is a bearer of gun. It started with the Kim Il-sung era in 1930s when Kim Il-sung was partitioned to fight against the Japanese imperialists. It's alleged it's like their legacy or the Sega. They got the 2 guns from his father. And then he used these guns to fight a more powerful, more military ready the Japanese imperialists. And suddenly Kim Jong-un, and not suddenly, actually North Korea has kept reiterating this kind of saga, but this time Kim Jong-un one more emphasized that it started from the Kim Il-sung's era. At that time, they have only 2 guns, but in his achievement is to have a very powerful treasure, which is Hwasong 17 and also Hwasong 15, all the ICBMs. So this is such a huge achievement of the Kim Jong-un, and it started with a mere 2 guns, but finally ended up the nuclear ICBMs. So I think this is very important for Kim Jong-un's legitimacy, even it's their identity of the regime itself. So I think this is a very important meaning for the North Korea.
Well, excellent. Another excellent analysis. In particular, it was quite interesting to hear that in addition to all those military and strategic implication, what Dr. Cho mentioned, which you also agree that it is very offensive and radical development, which raised the danger of actual use of a nuclear weapon on the Korean Peninsula. But at the same time, Professor Park, your opinion also was on that. What is the political implication of this new law? Kim Jong-un trying to make maybe North Korea as a official nuclear weapon state. And in that regard, which will be related to our final question, the possibility of denuclearization is getting even much smaller. But at the same time, this was also geared for domestic audience as Kim Jong-un's real big achievement, right? So in that sense, it's politically also was quite important new development. That's, I guess, there was Professor Park's excellent analysis of this new situation. Let's turn on to the second question, that is South Korea's position or policy with regard to this new development. In that, I should also point out that our South Korea has a new government under the President Yoon, newly elected this spring. And he comes in with a quite different policy approach to North Korea compared to previous Moon Jae-in government, which was heavily engaged in peaceful resolution or diplomatic solution of North Korea's problem, whereas President Yoon and his government tend to emphasize more of a principled approach in dealing with this nuclear issue. And during his campaign, he said also his government will not be pushed by this North Korea's provocation. And he suggested if there's any sign of major military provocation, there could be a preemptive attack from South Korea. And also, indeed, following this series of North Korea's military provocations, such as missile tests and nuclear law, he also responded with much more hard line in dealing with this, such as like expanding or starting the joint military exercise between the US and South Korea. And in that also kind of, created a kind of a cycle of, this from each side, tit for tat between the two, and yet at the same time, on the other hand, so cycle of what lots of expert worries about escalation of military tension on the Korean Peninsula. Yet at the same time, his government also, led by Unification Minister, proposed a audacious approach in engaging North Korea, saying that if North Korea decide to denuclearize or shows a sign of that denuclearization, his government is willing to engage much fully with many other incentives, including economic engagement. So, but so far, the North Korean response to this audacious proposal has been quite, in fact, skeptical, or if I say, or critical, in fact. So, how do you assess South Korea, especially under this new leadership, their policy or response to North Korea's, nuclear policy? Shall we go to the Dr. Jo again?
Thank you. This, I thought, was the most difficult question. So I'm in no place to evaluate the situation now, but I think for how I prepare for this question is maybe I should talk about the Audacious initiative and then the North Korea policy in general. As far as I understand, I think President's Audacious initiative places more weight on the deterrence and defense first than dialogues and persuasion. And I know that there have been some slight different explanations from the government as the Audacious initiative came out, but I am told that the most accurate kind of explanation was given by Kim Tae-ho, the first deputy director of the NSC. He stated, according to his statement, it states that government seeks to bring North Korea back to dialogues in the order of deterrence, dissuasion, and dialogue, the 3Ds. So the emphasis is, although dialogues are not excluded, of course, the deterrence measures are given the first emphasis. And for kind of my personal evaluation, I find such deterrence first policy important and critical. And if we compare to North Korea's series of provocations that started since the last years of Moon Jae-in administration, I think in this current context where we have already seen multiple provocations by North Korea, I think this deterrence first message is important to send the signal that military provocations and nuclear developments are not acceptable. And so the Audacious initiative in regards to the nuclear law, that was the topic of our first question. I think the release of it was also timely because it reaffirms the government's position, whether it is good or not. It reaffirms the government's position that it will not yield to North Korea's nuclear caution. But I think what is and will be crucial would be consistency, uniformity, and maybe a little bit of more confidence in the implementation of the policy, because as you all know, there are now ongoing debates whether this initiative is a repeated version of the President Lee Myung-bak's policy. But as far as I know, there are subtle differences, especially on the deterrence emphasis. So if that's the case, I think the government should better communicate how it is different. And when they communicate, I think the ministries and government should be more consistent in their clarifications. And at the same time, if I may add, I think the government should also acknowledge that there are resemblances, as the policy does put and ask for tangible actions from North Korea first to begin the dialogues, the comprehensive package deal. So there are resemblances. So, and also, I think if that's the policy take of the government. There is nothing wrong with having resemblances with the past government, and in fact, it actually signals more consistency as a kind of conservative policy take on North Korea, and can kind of contribute in reducing uncertainty in messaging. So since it's been out just now, it will depend on how it will unfold. Regarding North Korea policy in general, in terms of military, I think the government is basically focusing on the 3K system, the Korea Air Missile Defense, Korea Massive Punishment Retaliation, and the kill chain. The three axes as the South Korea's own military developments. And also, in order to deter North Korea's provocations, the government is placing emphasis on the RKUS extended deterrence measures. It is very difficult to assess now because the government is still in process. But if I go back to the first question of nuclear law, the background to why North Korea has put the article that says North Korea will automatically use the nuclear weapons when the decision makers are in threat. There are interpretations that these clauses were included because of the current government's emphasis on the 3K, the kill chain, so automatizing the response to the system. And so, as Professor Shin already mentioned, this cannot evade the cycle of tit for tat, and I also do agree that there is a fear of escalation. But if I may say, in terms of messaging, after North Korea's destruction of the Kaesong complex and the series of missile tests, and also with the recent announcement of the nuclear law, I think this deterrence first message makes more sense to me in this time. Thank you.
Okay, Professor Park.
Yes, already Dr. Cho mentioned that this Audacious initiative has 3 principles, that is dissuasion, deterrence, and dialogue. But at this very moment, I think we need to pay more attention and focus on the dissuasion and deterrence, because I think overall, North Korea has never changed their so-called policy direction or line. They first introduced so-called frontal breakthrough line. In Korean, we said 정면 돌파전 at the December of 2019, after the break of the Hanoi and the working level talk between the United States and North Korea and Sweden. And a very clear message of this line, the policy direction of frontal breakthrough line. And they're going to have going back to the old days, which means that they're going to have a hardline policy against both the United States and South Korea, unless United States has fully accepted what they want. North Korea has demanded to total withdrawal of so-called hostile policy toward the United States, toward North Korea by United States. And this hostile policy actually has consisted of 2 parts. One is their right to survive, which means that the United States should permanently hold joint military exercise, and also they should not send the strategic asset to the Korean Peninsula. And the other is their right to development. And we can easily imagine that they wanted to lifting up all the sanctions as they demand the February 2019 at the Hanoi, and 5 of them, but actually that's the comprehensive sanction, which means that the whole lifting of the sanctions. Unless the United States has to withdraw this hostile policy, North Korea is not going to have any meaningful dialogue with the United States and South Korea. But problem is that we all know that the United States, no matter who's the president and administration, I mean the Donald Trump or the Joe Biden, whoever it is, could not accept this kind of unilateral demand by the North Korea. At least the North Korea should come to the negotiation table. Then the United States may talk about this issue, but since 2019 and at the end of 2019, North Korea has totally refused any kind of talk with the United States, South Korea. So I think North Korea is intentionally demand this kind of the withdrawal of the hostile policy, because I think even North Korea knows that the United States could not accept this demand. So I think North Korea simply wanted to have some reasoning reasoning to continue to develop their nuclear weapons, nuclear missiles, and they are actually shown this kind of their policy throughout whole this year. We all remember that this year alone, they have more than 100-something missiles, including short range, medium range, even ICBMs. And they are the March 24th, and they are officially the withdraw and discard the moratorium they have promised in 2018 April. So this is the I can say the phase of the aggression, and they have just wanted to pursue this very ultimate goal, that is they want to be a de facto nuclear weapon state. So that's the sole purpose. They have no intention at this moment to talk with South Korea and United States. So that's I think the North Koreans, the policy and policy direction at this moment. And we haven't seen any kind of a signs or debate that they are going to change this policy direction. And today, actually, North Korea has introduced and announced that they are going to have a 6th plenary meeting of the 8th Central Committee of the Workers' People's Party at the end of December, as they did the last year. So they are going to introduce, I don't know whether the new direction or new policy line or not, but they are going to hold this very meaningful the meeting. Okay, going back to this audacious initiative, I know there is a very certain limit, a more fundamental limit, which is that is there any possibility North Korea would give up their nuclear weapon with some economic incentive or economic benefit? We are talking about this a lot. So-called, this is the economic security trade-off model, but including me, nobody believed that North Korea would give up their nuclear weapon with the economic incentive or economic compensation. And 4 days later, when the Yoon President Yoon introduced this audacious the initiative in his April 15th speech, and 4 days after, Kim Il-sung has issued a statement, and she critically, criticized this audacious initiative. She said that something as worthless as the economic cooperation, they are not going to give up their nuclear weapon, period. So this economic security trade-off model is whether it is working or not. I don't think they have any chance to give up their nuclear weapon. But I think, but at least 2 principles that Audacious Initiative has introduced is very meaningful. First, the Audacious Initiative includes South Korea is going to be the main actor to dealing with the North Korean nuclear issues. And unfortunately, start with Kim Il-sung era, we are not, South Korea is no longer the main actor to negotiate the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula with North Korea. Instead, United States is the one who actually negotiates with North Korea. But this Yoon Sung-yeol's audacious initiative is going, this South Korea should be the main actor. And second one is that I think it's more important. And they wanted to have the principle of the so-called comprehensive agreement and phase implementation. We all know that in order to have the fully denuclearized of North Korea, we have this roadmap, including the very clear definition of the final goal of denuclearization. Still, it's contentious whether we are pursuing the denuclearization of North Korea or denuclearization of Korean Peninsula. We all know that there's 2 very different concepts. So we have to verify which one is our ultimate goal. And then, of course, it should be some phased approach of the denuclearization, which means that in every stage, we are going to compensate of the North Koreas if they are really doing some really meaningful denuclearization steps. So the Audacious Initiative is one more time confirmed these very important principles of the denuclearization. So I think it's meaningful.
Thank you. Again, another excellent analysis. And so far, we've been discussing the North Korea's recent position and policy regarding nuclear issue. And the South Korean government policy regarding that North Korea's nuclear policy and provocation, it seems to me that both sides are not willing to make any kind of concession first. So this is really a kind of tit for tat, and the worry and concern is what if there is a major escalation of the tension that could lead to actual some kind of military event dispute between the two countries. But in that sense, also one other, I think, observation is that so far, despite the Yoon government audacious initiative, the chances for nuclear negotiation or diplomacy, at least between the two Koreas, are quite, at this moment, is dim and very small. What about other parties concerned in this case? For example, the US position or China, because in case of the American government under the Joe Biden, still, according to the recently published their national security strategy document, the Biden administration still talks about, along with their commitment for the extended deterrence of alliance, South Korean alliance, but at the same time, they still also talking about denuclearization through the peaceful, engagement, or in other way, diplomatic solution. But at the same time, as you suggested, there's no sign of contact between the Pyongyang and Washington so far. At the same time, recently there was a meeting the first meeting between President Xi Jinping and President Yoon Suk-yeol in the last G20 summit in Indonesia. And the report says that President Yoon asked Xi Jinping that China should play a certain role in inducing North Korea coming to the negotiation table. And then the Chinese President Xi Jinping says, no, he thinks South Korea should play a more positive role in that process. So with that kind of interaction between the South Korean government and the US and China, I mean, do you still think there's first, what is your take on these other important stakeholders, i.e. the US and Chinese position on this current situation? And finally, yes, still, given all this, is there still a path for denuclearization of North Korea? And if there's any chances, what could be? Yes.
If I may, can I go first?
Yes, please.
All right, okay. I think this is a very important issue. And if I said my argument first about these two very important countries, of course, United States, China, I'm pretty much kind of frustrated their policy toward the denuclearization of North Korea. And we have to have this John Bach here. And of course, he does not represent the Biden administration, but he's American. So I can ask him directly. And we all know that Joe Biden administration is simply busy about the foreign agendas. And of course, Ukraine war and the intensifying rivalry between the United States, China, and of course, they have their domestic problems too. So definitely the North Korean issue is not the top priority, although many high officials of the Biden administration keep saying that the North Korea is the very top priority, but we all know that it is not. And people like me are saying that the United States policies, like the President Obama's policy of the so-called strategic patience, season 2. And of course, actually, North Korea, I mean, United States has been trying their best. I mean, it's allegedly known that the Biden administration has offered 60 million doses of the vaccine to North Korea at the end of the last year, but North Korea has, simply launching of the missiles started with this year and refused to this vaccine. And also, it is known that one of the high officials, I think is the Secretary of State and Tony Blinken, sent a letter to North Korea that including a little bit detailed the denuclearization plan, which means that it's implied that United States offers some kind of possibility of lifting of some of sanctions if North Korea is entering the real denuclearization steps. But North Korea has refused to that. I just mentioned that. So definitely this time that for the North Koreans to emphasize advance their nuclear capability period. But still, I haven't seen any kind of active rule and more trying to kind of proactive to have any kind of dialogue with North Korea by the United States. So I'm kind of disappointed what the Biden administration has done for the past 2 years. It's not just my judgment, but evaluation. But in the United States, we are heard lots of this kind of assessment of the Biden administration policy toward North Korea. Many people say that it's failure and have to change, and we can hear this kind of voice a lot. And about China, yes, a very serious position. And I personally very interested in their reaction about the March 24th launch of the legendary Hwasong 17s of North Korea, because this is discarding of their moratorium that North Korea has promised in April 2018. You know that China is very sensitive of North Korea's ICBM because it relates to their the national security interest. Because if North Korea continue to develop ICBM and South Korea, United States, and Japan will be beefing up and strengthen the missile defense and missile network. And that is definitely influence the vital interest of China. But the March 26th, 2 days after, the United Nations Security Council, Zhang Jin, the Chinese ambassador to United Nations, and he clearly mentioning that this is the responsibility of the United States. He said that the United States should respect the North Korean's security concern. And after that, we see May, for the United States Security Council Resolution 2397, and China has exercised veto power, and very same explanation. And also, Professor Shin, you mentioned that after Xi Jinping Biden's summit and Wang Yi, and he mentioned exactly same things. So I think right after Xi Jinping Biden's meeting, I can expect that China is giving the green light to North Korea to launch another missiles or even including 7th nuclear test. And it turned out that it's true. Just end of the Xi Jinping Biden summit, North Korea has launched the Hwasong 17s. So we couldn't expect any kind of the cooperation to the denuclearization of North Korea by China. Of course, I don't need to talk about Russia. So this is whole situation. The international situation is very friendly to North Korea to develop their nuclear weapons. So I really worry about that.
Well, but at the same time, that also reminds me of one of the reasons why China has become much more skeptical or non-cooperative when it comes to this North Korea issue may have to do with U.S.-China bilateral relations. I mean, after Trump administration, trade war and hardline to China, again, this Biden administration, I mean, they are the very opposite of Trump administration in many aspects and in many policy, but one kind of continuing policy or common approach has been of China, quite remarkably. And in fact, Biden administration's policy towards China has been much more, in a way, aggressive. And many say Trump was there was a lot of talk, but no actual policy, but in case of Biden, there's a lot of the concrete and practical policy that they're enforcing. Of course, not only they also call China as the most important long-term security challenge in their latest national security strategy document. So maybe that's one of the background of all this Chinese position regarding North Korea. Anyway.
Okay, if I may, I will make a very short comment. Yes, Professor Shin, I agree with that. Until the latter second half of the 2018, I think China considered the North Korea as some kind of a liability, because until that time, the Sino-US relationship has been very good under the Trump, but suddenly Trump changed the whole policy and they give a very aggressive policy toward the China at the latter half of the 2018. And then since then, North Korea considered China considered North Korea as the asset. So definitely they changed the very fundamental perception about North Korea because of this intensifying confrontation between the United States and China. Yes, definitely I agree with you.
Okay, then what about Dr. Cho, your take on this?
I have nothing very much to add on this two very comprehensive response to the question. But I think the main kind of problem with why denuclearization has become more difficult is that North Korea's nukes has become even more a niche subject after the Ukraine. It's been always so. North Korea has not been the forefront of the major powers of defense and security strategy, but this kind of phenomenon has definitely strengthened after Russia invaded Ukraine. This is just reiteration of what's been already said, but in the case of the US, their definite priority lies in Russia, China, and maybe, of course, Iran before North Korea. For the China case, China's limited kind of cooperation in the issue is clear, especially when we look at there will be no UNSC resolution again after as China and Russia veto the process. This kind of major powers non-cooperation on the issue, it will be the what we'll see in the future. And also another, if I may add, US's major priority now lies in dealing with what they call axis of adversaries. This is not an official concept, but from the US, many government officials use this concept, I think, because after the Ukraine, they are seeing the trilateral cooperation between Russia, China, and possibly also North Korea. So they are saying that if the US has went through the axis of evil in the 2000s, now they are will be headed towards dealing with axis of adversaries. It definitely put North Korea's position in their policy will be again very small. And also I think we should also talk about Europe. Europe's it's of course on the other side of the world and has been always not bilateral kind of engagement of each European countries has been little on North Korea issue. And this is understandable from the geographic distance. And their kind of evaluation is always that North Korea's problem is a frozen conflict. To South Koreans who are living right below North Korea's tactical nukes and missile tests are important developments. But for them, seen from distance, they are just North Korea doing what they have been doing before. So given this kind of reluctance and also maybe disinterest of the countries on North Korea issue, I think the path for denuclearization lies really in, as Professor Park Won-gun mentioned, South Korea taking the main actor role in putting forth this agenda more. I think this is really important, as we have to acknowledge that North Korea is no longer the priority topic for many, and South Korea's role will be ever more important. And another, maybe two more points regarding denuclearization of North Korea. I think it is important for North Korea. I know this is difficult, but North Korea should know that, should be persuaded on the utility of the nuclear weapons. From the Russia's current development regarding the Ukraine, I know that Russia's frustration is that although they have nuclear weapons, Russia is not able to stop the Western continued support for Ukraine. So having nuclear weapons does not solve everything. And although as Professor Park Won-gun mentioned, that the nuclear weapons are for political purposes of North Korea, that should be dealt differently. But for the sake of military, we should convey that there is no utility of nuclear weapons. Unless North Korea is persuaded, I think denuclearization will not be possible. And lastly, I guess the path for denuclearization through peaceful dialogues only is kind of over. If we are to accept that nuclear weapons of North Korea is a fait accompli. If that's the case, I think we have to seek ways where we can develop new agenda for denuclearization through more strength and more resilience. And South Korea should take the role and be more voiced in the international community.
Well, excellent. Thank you. And we are so delighted to have Dr. Park here. Was a little late due to his delay of flight schedule, but I'm glad that finally you could join us. And for your information, if I may just briefly summarize what has been discussed between these two excellent panels. We talked about the first issue of the recent North Korea's nuclear policy, including new nuclear law and testing of lots of missiles, along with the latest successful test of those Hwasong 17. And on that first question, the two panels are quite on the same page. Definitely, this is not a good sign, and it means North Korea is becoming much more offensive or radical when it comes to nuclear doctrine, and there's also hardening of their position regarding nuclear weapon, but also the worry is that there's even they specifying possible use of a nuclear weapon on the Korean Peninsula. This is a new development in a sense that so far we regarded North Korea's nuclear development as mainly as the key for their regime survival and deterrence measure, but it goes further than such a kind of simple deterrence. And when it comes to the second question of, then what about the South Korea's policy, especially under this new Yoon administration? And again, they're also saying that on one hand, it is understandable for Yoon government to take this kind of, focusing on the deterrence and dissuasion before talks about dialogue. And Yoon has been taking very much principled approach or hardline approach regarding North Korea. But that made the situation more kind of escalatory. That's another fact. Along with the South Korea's military exercise with the United States and deployment of all these strategic assets to the Korean Peninsula whenever North Korea provoke with this new missile test. And in that context, even though Yoon government also tried some diplomacy with their Audacious initiative, so far it has not been very effective and successful in persuading North Korean or dissuading North Korea's nuclear ambition. And finally, but then what about the other important stakeholders in these issues? that is US and China. On that front as well, as you just listened to Dr. Zhou's opinion, along with Professor Park, they were also quite skeptical about their policy and position with regard to engaging North Korea or nuclear negotiation. So it seems like so far the prospect and the question about the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, the answer is pretty much negative and very lots of pessimism, to dominate appears with this room at this discussion at this moment. So I really hope you can deliver some kind of a silver lining and some the hope for comment on this Korean Peninsula situation. But still, please feel free to talk about all those. First, North Korea's new recent development. Second, South Korean government policy. And of course, we are very keen on your take on the US position and Biden's administration's policy, and especially what's the prospect of US engagement with North Korea for denuclearization, because Biden administration published those NSS documents still clearly says their goal is denuclearization, right? So what is your take on that?
All right, Professor Shin, before we are hearing from this John Barks.
Yeah, if you have any question to
yes,
John.
I'd like to make a comment and also related questions to you. And before you are joining, John, I'm actually very looking forward to hearing from you, because although you are not the represent the Joe Biden's administration, but we'd like to hear from the American perspective. So in that regard, about the Professor Shin mentioned about the recent South Korea, United States, even Japan's the trilateral military cooperation. I think that this is very important, and in some sense it's inevitable, because North Korea is continuing to have very offensive and aggressive postures, and especially when they introduced the law about their nuclear, and this kind of blurring of the conventional weapons and the nuclear weapons, which means that they are lowering the bar to use the tactical nuclear weapon in the real field. So we know that South Korea, we do not have the nuclear weapon. We don't have any, of course, we're trying to enhance our conventional, capability, but it could not match the nuclear weapons. We have that. It means that we have to 100% to rely on the so-called extended deterrence of the United States. But problem is that we are not sure whether the United States will have a 100% guarantee of the. I believe in the United States commitment, but there are various scenarios that actually North Korea will use this kind of a gap to actually implement the extended deterrence. So that's why right now in Korea, we are talking about the various options, including the nuclear sharing and they bring the tactical the American nuclear, the weapons to Korean Peninsula. Even some people say that the South Korea's own nuclear armament. And so from our perspective, we are getting more worried about the North Korea's actual use of the nuclear weapon, but still the United States just mentioning that, the South Korea should believe in the United States, but not institutionalized, not enhance the actual policy of this extended deterrence. So I want to hear from John, then what is the United States, the attitude and the perception of this issue? Okay.
Thank you so much. It's great to see you all, and really grateful for your patience here. The way that it's all framed here, and thank you so much for that helpful synopsis, Professor Shin. I would like to approach it in terms of two buckets. First, the big picture from the US perspective, and then zeroing in on the Korean Peninsula. First, the big picture, clearly the dominance of the focus on China. If you think of a pie chart and the distribution of time and effort, right now, the majority of that pie chart is focused on China and concern in Washington about a contingency related to Taiwan. I can't convey enough how much, as I observe it as well and engage with friends and colleagues who are serving in Washington as well, how much that is occupying their their focus at the moment. So if you view it from that perspective, China is framed as the pacing challenge. You see this manifest itself in a US-China tech war, where there's a greater focus on semiconductor. In South Korea, Samsung, Jeonja, SK Hynix, they're square in the middle of that as well with TSMC. But with this focus on China, you also have the US devoting a significant amount of that pie chart to dealing with Russia. And what Defense Secretary Austin calls providing weapons to the Ukrainians at the speed of war. So the sheer logistics of providing that to Ukraine, and then all of the different arrangements with NATO partners where NATO allies provide weapons to Ukraine and the US figures out ways to replenish NATO allies, and also South Korean companies now a part of this in terms of armament supplies. This is a massive undertaking. And if you think of it day to day, this is something that is, again, taking up a lot of mind share and focus and that type of planning aspect. So then from that pie chart in the big picture, the remaining sliver as it relates to the Korean Peninsula, the US approach has been very consistent in the Biden administration in terms of what Biden administration officials have been saying in the overtures to North Korea for some kind of dialogue. The different channels, all of them have been tried. And the consistent response is radio silence. The North Koreans have not reciprocated. And so from the dialogue effort, they continually make that offer to meet with North Korea. And the latest offers are with no preconditions. Now, to address the issues that have been put on the table, and thank you for adding a lot of the different commentaries, Dr. Zhou and Professor Pak here. I would add this comment in terms of the angle as we zoom into the Korean Peninsula. The dynamics are clearly one where the statements, as Professor Shin has mentioned earlier, it is now codified in the North Korean constitution. We've had recent statements where essentially North Korea said that under no circumstances would they give up their nuclear weapons. The part I wanted to add here is we're engaged in a project with former negotiators from the United States, South Korea, Japan, and China. And the focus of the project is to look at their experience dealing with North Korea. One of the interesting things that comes out is that for every single one of these former negotiators on that cusp of being appointed as their respective country's chief negotiator, North Korea was in a similar position where they had said defiantly they'll never give up their nuclear weapons. This is something that's non-negotiable. Clearly, the difference today is that North Korea's program is far more advanced than those periods of negotiations. But in engaging and doing this research project with the former negotiators, there's a consensus view that North Korea is getting ready to essentially re-engage in negotiations. Then the question mark is, what are they going to put on the table? If you poll the different technical experts, this overarching curiosity of what North Korea would potentially put on the table is viewed through the lens in a big debate in Washington right now. There are strong proponents in Washington saying, look, North Korean nuclear weapons development and advancement is a fact of life. We have to more or less recognize North Korea as a nuclear weapon state. We have to engage North Korea in an arms control format. Other side of the debate basically saying that that is very complex and that would unleash a host of unintended consequences, particularly in relationships with allies like South Korea. On the other side of the debate is the denuclearization camp saying, yes, this is something that is going to be complex, but aspirationally, we have to stick with this. And that with the whole effort to engage North Korea, easing of sanctions, looking at ways to cooperate with China, and this still remains one area where in many respects there are opportunities to cooperate with China, that we can get into a process. So it isn't the immediate goal of denuclearization, but the process eventually, and there's no specificity on timeline, eventually leading to denuclearization. So those are the two big debates. And the two things I wanted to mention and turn it back to you, Professor Shin, is if you look at it from that perspective, again, this is a part of the analysis of what North Korea potentially could put on the table. That would be some version of touching as a concentric circle and what the US politically, in terms of feasibility, might be able to engage on. There really is only one thing, and that's a freeze. So particularly a freeze of their missile testing. And so my senior colleagues at the Belfer Center, the Kennedy School, who are former negotiators who have dealt with North Korea, they view this as plausible because if you think of a freeze of the nuclear program, verification is something that would be very complex and unlikely something that we could get to agreement on very soon. But if there is agreement on freezing of North Korea's missile testing, it's pretty easy to verify. If North Korea doesn't test, then there's your verification, as my senior colleagues mentioned. And so this is something that, to the instructions for Professor Shin, here I'm trying to be positive amidst a lot of points that I agree with Dr. Zhou and Professor Pak. It is a gloomy situation. There are areas where I think we have to think anew in terms of how to address this very complex, intractable and multifaceted challenge on the Korean Peninsula. But if I were to force myself to somehow be creative and look at this in more detail, even if it's a small sliver, I do think this part of getting ready, what North Korea would get in return for a freeze on their missile testing would be a beginning to at least slow down this escalation cycle that we're in. The final point I mentioned on that is that North Korea, we know on a number of fronts, given their policy of shutting down their border access for COVID policy related to prevention, it has been a huge drain on their economy. And I think one of the interesting overtures, the letter from Xi Jinping to Kim Jong-un, essentially laying out a means for economic engagement again. And granted, this is something that China is unlikely to coordinate. This is something that China is specifically doing. But I do believe the signs here are that China is trying to dampen things down, where it might not be an explicit connection, but the understanding that for the resumption of trade desperately needed by North Korea and access to the Chinese marketplace, there would need to be a certain type of environment, a certain type of situation that would be conducive to the more robust access to the Chinese marketplace. I think that could be the catalyst. And through that, we can start exploring potentially what this freeze aspect. And again, this isn't a comprehensive agreement to conclude this problem, but under the heading of trying to slow down this rapid escalation of tensions. So with that, I'll turn it back to you. Thank you, Professor Shin.
All right, Professor Shin, if I may.
Yes, please. Yeah.
All right. John, actually, I know very well about this debate, ongoing debate in Washington, D.C., and I was kind of surprised at the Richard Haas, and he wrote about the North Korean denuclearization issue, the project syndicate last month. Actually, that's October, 2 months ago. And I heard that the growing voice to take some kind of a realistic approach, and you just mentioned that we have to, the United States have to have some arms control the options rather than fully denuclearize North Korea. That's unrealistic. But probably, and then I know that some people are arguing that the freeze of the North Korea's nuclear development, especially about the ICBMs, and that's exactly what I worry about that. Because if United States chose this position, and we know that it means that North Korea is actually de facto nuclear weapon state. If we lifting up the sum of sanctions in compensate for the simply freezing about their ICBM development, then we all know that the North Korean economy, under this economic sanction for past several, I think a decade, they are survived, but if lifting up some of them, and it can be very easily back to the old days and resilient of their economy, with of course helping of the China, then probably North Korea will continue to have this negotiation with the United States, so-called salami tactics, and they are going to have a partial denuclearization at the maximum. So exactly what we worry about that. So that still. I know the Biden administrations never gave up the ultimate goal of the full denuclearization of North Korea, but I really worry about this the growing voice of these so-called unrealistic options. Should choose the options among the many influential strategists, American strategists.
John?
Yeah, very briefly, I think on those points that you mentioned, Professor Black, the element that I think resonates very strongly is we have more and more very public figures talking about an arms control arrangement with North Korea. But there is a gap because, as you point out, on the government side and the Biden administration side, there really isn't any change in terms of the adherence to denuclearization. To your point about, in practice, this de facto recognition and treatment of North Korea as a nuclear weapon state, I bring China into the analysis, because if you look at how China has been engaging with North Korea, China has more or less accepted North Korea as a nuclear weapon state. If you look at the extent to which they've opened up their economy, the extent to which the two parties are coordinating with each other, this is something where the Chinese focus on stability, the Chinese focus on North Korea being a responsible nuclear weapon state, they haven't said that. But those are the lanes of interaction that in the marketplace of policies, we have to consider, because that is what's setting the price for everyone else. So as much as we explore ways to deal with North Korea, from a North Korean perspective, they have a number of options as they see it. And whatever we do by way either of coercion or incentives, that's always going to be benchmarked to what the Chinese are providing under each of those headings. One interesting area of convergence was the fall of 2017, where even the Chinese leadership said, this is really dangerous. North Korea, you have to stop this. And North Korea was the focus of China, reducing the flow of oil from China into North Korea. That's the clearest sign of China taking it seriously. But the key takeaway there, the lesson for North Korea, I think, was as much as the Trump administration was trying to get the Chinese to cut it off 100%, China publicly said no, because they didn't want to trigger the inadvertent collapse of North Korea, enough to send the message to North Korea that this is serious and they have to modify their behavior, but not to the extent of shutting things down, where from a US perspective, that would be the ultimate change of North Korean behavior and the tipping point in getting North Korea to commit to denuclearization. That for all of us is an inconvenient fact, because that means from a North Korean perspective, they know how far China will go. And with that provides room, even if it's small, that room to maneuver. I think we have to embed that analysis before we look at other options in terms of dealing with North Korea, because without that, there are a whole slew of areas of movement that I think from a North Korean perspective, it's not as desperate as it may look. So from a US perspective, if we apply this much more sanctions or economic pressure, we'll have North Korea where we're at. If you minus the Chinese piece of that equation, that might be the case. But given that level, and think about it, the Chinese have opened up their economy, their national marketplace to North Korean state trading companies and North Korean elites. So once they've did that, we essentially are looking at the devaluing of some of the key North Korean focused sanctions. And so I would just put under the category of these are certain features in terms of a China-North Korea economic relationship that we have to factor into our analysis to see how effective other measures or other offers may be.
Well, great. I mean, John, I know that in the past you've been also doing lots of research on the border trade between the North Korea and China. So I think that also, given that kind of your background, you provide us a very interesting angle in this current ongoing nuclear saga between North Korea and other stakeholders. This is well beyond our original schedule. We had a very excellent panelists who provided us a great analysis and their expert opinion on this very difficult issue. Always the North Korea's nuclear development and still the possibility of denuclearization. Although I guess at the moment, the rooms are quite gloomy with all kinds of negative development in recent on the Korean Peninsula, but not only that, the region and the whole world. But at the same time, I think there is always hope. And I think Dr. Park, John provided us at the last minute a sliver of hope for restarting negotiation and engaging North Korea. Maybe that's still we have to, we should not give up. Okay, on that note, let me conclude today's session. Thank you so much for all your great, expertise and opinion. Thank you. Bye now.